Colin Powell. You all remember him, right? He was the nice man who was the reasonable guy in the Bush administration, the one who said if we need to go to war with Iraq, we really need to go to a war with Iraq. He doesn't walk around with talcum powder, folks, in little vials and then just whip it out at the United Nations. No, he brought that specifically that day to make a point, and that was it was just a matter of time before we were all poisoned by a biological attack from Saddam Hussein. Don't let the smoking gun be a mushroom cloud or a cloud of biological agents. And of course, this was the day that Tom Friedman and all the other establishment writers in this country, whether they were right or left, supposedly, said, wow, this is a slam dunk. When Colin Powell says we have to invade a country, we really do have to invade a country. Well, we've known for some time that he claims that he was lied to as well. Sort of. I mean, it's not totally clear. Back in around 2005, Lawrence Wilkerson, his chief of staff, started doing the rounds, painting a picture of a Colin Powell who trusted those around him to give him the proper information. At first, it seemed that it was Tenet was to blame, George Tenet, but then it sort of seemed like it wasn't. I mean, nobody's coming out and taking any responsibility for this. And now, Colin Powell has written a book. This is not the same of his biography, which, of course, he didn't do. But it is a book entitled, It Worked for Me in Life and Leadership. Yes, it did work for Colin Powell as he's writing books and touring around, giving speaking engagements. One of the revelations in his book, and this is going to come as a shock to all of you, and this is where I would need my sound effect board to say, surprise, surprise. But he also contends, contrary to what George Bush said. You remember George Bush wrote a book. I think it was in crayon. I didn't get a chance to read it. Decision points. And, of course, one of those decision points was when we all gather around to talk about whether we should go after Iraq. And according to George Bush was really one of the guys who was really reluctant to attack Iraq because I didn't want to use force. Well, Colin Powell sneaks into his leadership parable book that there was never a decision point. It just seemed a foregone conclusion that the National Security Council never even met to discuss invading Iraq. And we've heard the same thing from Condi Rice and George Tenet, that there was never a debate about whether or not they were going into Iraq. It was more or less just how are we going to do it. And so that's there. But what we're seeing now is just, one more attempt to sort of whitewash one of these players' role in this debacle. Powell briefly touches on how he came to provide that false and misleading information that he was forced to pass on at the United Nations. And, of course, he blames Dick Cheney and Scooter Libby in particular, who wrote a memo. Scooter is the sort of the easy whipping boy in that administration. But, of course, they were all at fault. There was plenty of evidence that Curveball, who recently came out and said, yeah, I lied about all of it, was a source not to be trusted because the Clinton administration and under the Clinton administration, the CIA had rejected this guy's story literally maybe a half a dozen times, documented times. This guy's a nut job. This guy's got his own agenda. And it wasn't until Cheney et al. Requested 22 briefings from the CIA, when I think number 22 was the one where they got what they wanted. And Powell, in his book, gives himself credit for rejecting some of the lies that Cheney wanted to use. He acknowledges in the book, according to Dan Frumpkin, who apparently got an advance copy, that, quote, one of my most momentous failures, the one with the widest ranging impact, was his speech at the UN. But he also concludes that every senior U.S. official would have made the exact same case. So in other words, this was a massive screw-up, but I cannot be blamed for it because anyone would have made that same massive screw-up. And then he says the lesson of all this is, quote, always try to get over failure quickly. Learn from it. Study how you contribute to it, and if you're responsible for it, own up to it. He writes in a book 10 years later. A book, incidentally, that's just about leadership parables. If you're the CEO of a company, let's say, where ostensibly, I guess, if your screw-up is really big, you lose a lot of money for your shareholders. In this case, Powell's screw-up, well over 100,000 civilians dead, nearly 5,000 U.S. military personnel dead, tens of thousands in some way injured, probably with lifelong scars, whether they're physical or emotional. Millions upon millions of Iraqis, either in exile or internally displaced. But what are you going to do? Learn from your mistakes and try not to make them again. And the best line in this piece by Dan Frumpkin, and for a long time I thought Wilkerson was being sent out there to whitewash for Powell. And the only thing Wilkerson will say, what do you make of his conclusory lesson, the one about, I've just got to move on. Acknowledge your mistakes to yourself, and then move on and know you're going to get a big payday. Wilkerson says, quote, Powell's rules are for everyone else. That's what makes it such a must-read. Unbelievable. Not an ounce of accountability. And I want to remind you, Colin Powell, you'll recall, as he was holding up that vial of powder, and he was showing you pictures of essentially an ice cream truck that some would call an ice cream truck. Other people would say, hey, that's a mobile biological weapons lab. It was actually closer to a ice cream truck. But he read off intercepts that U.S. listening devices. Remember, the U.S. supposedly had a long list of storage facilities and labs that were developing all of this incredible biological agents that were going to take us out. Remember, it takes like a ton of ricin to kill like 100 men on a battlefield. But nevertheless, we had this long list. And you'll remember that when Colin Powell was in front of the United Nations, he was holding up this vial. There were hundreds of UN weapons inspectors in country saying to the CIA, hey, where's that list? Because we can't find anything. Do you have a double top secret list? Because the list that you sent us, there's nothing there. And Powell read off intercepts between Iraqi commanders and Iraqis at these different locations. And the intercepts, as Powell read them, seemed to suggest that these Iraqis were hiding things. But in fact, And Powell surely knew because he changed the wording and the emphasis and left certain things out in his retelling of this. All they were doing was, you guys better certify. The commanders were saying, you better certify to us that there's no weapons of mass destruction there, that there's nothing that could be considered weapons of mass destruction. You better look around your base and make sure nobody's got anything. And if they don't, you better tell us, because we keep telling the Americans we don't have it at this point. So you better certify, which is exactly what you would do if you were trying to prove that you don't have any. But that's, of course, not the way it was presented to us. We were led into a war of choice. And you know who's been held accountable for that? Nobody. But what are you going to do? You know, as Colin Powell says, you know, realize you made your mistakes. Own up to them. But also say that anybody else would have made the exact same mistake. So you're not really owning up to it. It's not really a mistake, is it? I mean, if every single other person would do that, that's not really a mistake. It's just your job. And then go on to make a lot of money. And hopefully clean up your reputation so that you still get written about well in the history books. It really is disgusting.